I'm Laura Lucas Magnuson, and this is The World Unpacked.
Chaos erupted at the U.S. Capitol today when pro-Trump demonstrators breached barricades and pushed their way inside as lawmakers were in the process of making President-elect Biden's election official.
The leading critic of the Kremlin, Alexei Navalny, has been detained by police after returning to Moscow for the first time since being poisoned with a nerve agent in an attack he blames on the Russian authorities.
The military has carried out a coup d'etat in Myanmar. They've seized control of the country and detained key government officials, including the country's de facto leader, Aung San Suu Kyi.
In countries from Brazil to South Korea, thousands gathered in their city streets to make their voices heard. Roxana said.
After the conviction of George Floyd's murderer, we can see how right she was if we have the courage to act as a Congress. We've all seen the knee of injustice on the neck of Black Americans. Now's our opportunity to make some real progress. We have to prove democracy still works, that our government still works, and we can deliver for our people.
More than 100 days into Joe Biden's presidency, it's clear President Biden is staking a part of his legacy on the value of democracy, both at home and abroad. He's facing major headwinds. In this year alone, a military coup overthrew Myanmar's government. The Kremlin arrested prominent political dissident Alexei Navalny, and China has continued to tighten its grip around Hong Kong. And in the United States, we still have not fully come to grips with the unprecedented attack on the U.S. Capitol on January 6th. Yet President Biden continues to make advancing democracy a key element of his policy, including in his address to Congress last week. Will he be able to deliver on this agenda? With me today to discuss these issues is Ashley Quarcoo, a senior fellow in Carnegie's Democracy, Conflict, and Governance program. Ashley's research focuses on democracy building, social cohesion, and political polarization. Before joining the think tank world, Ashley spent nearly a decade working with the U.S. Agency for International Development on peace building and democratic development in post-conflict countries. Today, we'll talk about how the United States can promote democracy both at home and abroad. Welcome, Ashley.
Thanks so much.
Ashley, I want to begin first by addressing the state of democracy at home in the United States. You've noted that domestic terrorism is one of the main challenges President Biden must tackle in reviving democracy in the U.S., especially in the wake of the January 6th attack on the Capitol. How do you see this manifesting in Biden's policymaking so far?
Yeah, so we have seen a real shift from this administration in terms of acknowledging domestic extremism as a significant and growing threat to the country. One way that this has shown up was in Biden's interim national security guidance, which is kind of the intermediate strategic guidance that he will issue before he issues a broader national security policy. And in that, we saw, less of an emphasis certainly on global terrorism threats and much more acknowledgement of this issue of domestic terrorism and political extremism, which in and of itself is somewhat of a shift. And I think we've also seen the administration move aggressively both to pursue the perpetrators of the January 6th attack sort of narrowly understood, but then to look much more broadly at this rise of extremism as a threat to the nation's security and to democracy. And because this was not really a priority area for the Trump administration, the Biden team has really been starting to build out the architecture to understand this threat, to respond to it. They've announced an interagency plan to combat domestic terrorism. They've issued and released a new intelligence assessment that will, better help the government understand the threat and respond to it. They've released some initial new funding for state and local authorities to respond, and also are beginning efforts to understand the degree to which extremism is permeating in the military. So these are all important signs that this is an increasing focus for this administration.
Over the last year, we've seen mass protests for racial justice across the United States as another manifestation of the systemic issues America faces in making democracy work for all. And most recently, we've seen growing solidarity with Asian Americans after a terrible increase in Asian American hate crimes. You joined the show last summer to talk about racial justice in the United States and around the world. What's changed since then, and what are the challenges policymakers and activists have come across in overcoming these systemic problems?
So I think there have been some important changes, but I think, some things change and some things stay the same. So in the wake of the protests last summer, we did see major shifts in public opinion among Americans in terms of their support for the Black Lives Matter movement. But public opinion is a fickle thing. And now that we're nearly a year after Mr. Floyd's death, even after the conviction of his murderer, support for the Black Lives Matter movement has fallen, particularly among white Americans. It's really gone back to about where it was prior to Mr. Floyd's death. But I think even those temporary changes in public opinion were significant enough to put issues of racial justice, of racial equity, and particularly policing reform on the agenda for public policy makers. And we did see some changes happen in cities like Los Angeles and Baltimore. There were changes in budget allocations. So we saw the reallocation of resources away from policing. In Baltimore, it was about $22 million reallocated to other kinds of social services. But I think in other places, this sort of significant reform efforts around the reallocation of budgets, police budgets, haven't really moved forward. Minneapolis, which was ground zero for the Floyd murder, and also, which after the aftermath of that made promises that it was going to reinvent policing, they've really been stymied in efforts to diminish police funding. And this is in part, got caught up in the 2020 election cycle, where this issue around defunding police became, deeply, deeply politicized and made it much more difficult to even have a public debate on, and certainly for public officials to take action on. But I think there's sort of a related issue, which is, what does appropriate policing look like, and what tactics are and are not appropriate. And that's an area of both robust debate and more agreement, I think, in many cases. So there's a scholar, Christian Davenport, who has done some examination of the specific tactics and the degree to which there's agreement among white and Black Americans. For example, should a police officer put a knee on the back of a suspect? Is it appropriate for police to beat protesters with a baton or use tear gas? And there is actually lots of agreement across racial divides on specific tactics. And so I think that's an area of optimism. There's legislation pending on the Hill on the police reform, which also has more traction than some other areas. And also, I think, more broadly than just the policing thing, we've seen the Biden administration really take up this mantle of racial equity as key in terms of his domestic governing agenda, elevating this as a sort of cross-cutting area of focus, looking at, of course, the pandemic and health, but also issues around the environment, transportation, and housing. So it has made an impact.
And foreign policy as well. We've seen a lot on that too. You've also written about the ways that racial injustice is often analyzed and talked about separately from discussions or analysis of democracy. Why do you think that is? And what kind of framing might help people think about these issues as more closely linked?
Around the world, when we're used to talking about democracy in tandem with human rights, as a matter of foreign policy, as you know well, Laura, we have whole institutions in our Department of State that are focused on advancing democracy and human rights around the world, and we see them as linked. Human rights are violations are things that undermine democracy because they impede the ability of citizens to participate fully in political life and in civic life. I think, here in the U.S., we don't really have the same kind of lexicon around human rights. Right. We use different vocabulary. We use civil rights, which has a very long and storied history, but is sort of, I think, narrowly focused on issues of voting rights and political participation. They are, of course, human rights, but we sort of focus on that particular aspect. We have the lexicon of racial injustice, which I think speaks also to human rights, but tends to focus on discrimination and violations within the criminal justice sector. So I think that human rights is a lens which is more of a universal, is sort of a universalizing way of thinking about the endowment that every individual has with rights and protections, regardless of their race, their religion, their political ideology. And they imbue democracy, I think, with this idea that all human life has dignity. All human lives deserve, the opportunity for full realization of their potential and the protection from abuse. And that's an important framing that aligns well with our understanding of what sets democracies apart from other kinds of government, which I think is important. And I think it also gives us a way to talk about what's happening here in the US in the same way that we talk about these issues globally. And one of the lessons I think we can take from the last year has been the need for the US to be much more consistent around how we talk about and engage in human rights policy globally, as well as how we live up to those commitments at home.
I want to turn to how the pandemic has impacted American democracy. I know that you've thought about sort of how the pandemic has curtailed the accessibility of information, for instance, with the closure of newsrooms, limited access to public records. And of course, disinformation has played a huge role in spreading false narratives about the virus. How do you think about the way that these trends impact democracy?
Yeah, so you hit on these three major trends that I feel like have been important around the information environment. I mean, one is this degree to which citizens have had less access to government information. Of course, it's sort of normal. Governments are shut down, people aren't working. So this sort of services like access to public records really get put on the back burner. But we've seen the importance of this, even just looking at the case of New York, where a local watchdog organization made a Freedom of Information request to release nursing home death data. And it took 6 months for that data to come out. And when it finally did, under pressure of a court order, it revealed that nearly 6,000 more people had died in nursing homes that had been previously reported. So we see the really damaging impacts of sort of even just the lack of access to public records in terms of transparency and accountability of government activity. The second area around this issue, around the decline of local news, this has been a longstanding negative trend in terms of U.S. democracy, but it's really been accelerated by the pandemic. Local news is always a critical, set of eyes and ears on issues of local importance that are not going to get covered by a national news outlet. And in a pandemic, this local reporting becomes so much more critical. It's sort of, they're both this watchdog function, but they provide public information about, stay-at-home ordinances and infection rates and testing access and vaccine distribution. And these are just critical things that people are really are hungry for that information and are looking for their local outlets to help them navigate these things. And I think, more broadly, we already do have trillions of dollars of relief flooding into jurisdictions around the country, possible new package of trillions of dollars of infrastructure spending. We need these local outlets to help provide oversight over how that relief money is going to be spent, to make sure the public understands that and knows how to access it. So it's really a lifeline of democracy, this access to information. And then, the issue around misinformation, conspiracism, hate speech, it has really undermined public trust. And I think we underestimate the degree to which trust is like sort of this invisible glue that keeps democracy together. But, people already didn't trust the media. They trust it less. Their trust in institutions has declined. It's clearly undermined pandemic response. It's clearly fanned the flames of violence and hate, in ways that have been just so harmful to Americans of East Asian and Pacific Island descent. And so all of these things, I think, have been important things to address and understand the impacts of in terms of the COVID impacts on democracy.
Are there any positive effects of the pandemic? I mean, we've actually seen this, right? Some things are good and some things are bad. So from a democracy perspective, is there anything that you think has been a benefit of the past year?
Yeah, I feel like this is a mixed bag too, but some good things. I mean, one is, most countries that had to have an election in this pandemic year didn't necessarily have great voter turnout, for example. So I think we sort of forget in all of the controversy of our election, how amazing it was that we had the highest level of turnout than we've had in 100 years. And of course, a lot of that turnout interest was because of the very strong partisan views on former President Trump. But we have 10,000 local jurisdictions around this country that administer elections, and think about the accommodations that they had to make in order to facilitate this high voter turnout, to facilitate voting in the midst of a pandemic. And I think that, I think it's easy to lose sight of the great innovations that local election administrators were able to make to expand access to early voting, to mail-in voting. We saw, special arrangements like curbside voting in some places so that they can make sure that people who had COVID and couldn't mingle with the public would go to vote. So I think that's a real positive. And I think, it's incredibly disheartening to see many of those kinds of innovations rolled back now. But it does demonstrate that we do have this ability to really expand dramatically access to the franchise, which I think is important. I think a couple of other things. One is that the pandemic, as horrible it has really put a spotlight on issues of systemic racism within the health sector, particularly as we've seen minority communities, African American communities, Native American communities be disproportionately impacted. And so we've seen the Biden administration really respond to that disparity, focusing on the pandemic response with a new high-level advisor that's going to address the systemic racism in the healthcare system. And more broadly, again, as I've said, thinking about racial equity across the board. And then I think an undertold story is the importance that really collective action has helped the country navigate this pandemic. Just from a humanitarian perspective, we've had such great mutual aid, faith-based assistance efforts, like massive organizing and networking across just people helping each other. And I think that's a positive that doesn't get enough attention and everything that's been going on.
The other thing I've been struck by is the conversation around not that more government is good, but that the pandemic has shown how effective, especially state and local governments can be, when resources are marshaled, and whether that will be a long-term trend that people appreciate those services or only within the pandemic, but not in other sectors. And, certainly that's something that President Biden is testing really around some of the measures that he's putting forward this year.
Yeah, absolutely.
So in his joint address to Congress last week on the 100 days in office, on this note, Biden said, we have to prove that American democracy still works, that it can deliver for people. So what is it about how democracy is working here at home and abroad that drove him to frame it that way? And what are the remedies when democracies underperform?
So, democracy is, in my view, the best system for guaranteeing freedom, for guaranteeing human dignity. But in this country, it has also, especially since about 1980, presided over the steep rise of inequality, wealth stagnation, sharp divergence between the economic prospects of the upper middle class compared to the middle and lower class families. We have problems with the affordability of healthcare, and there's just people sort of looking to seek economic opportunity and security. It feels very tenuous. And then we have, of course, the things that have been exposed by the pandemic and by the protest for racial justice. These always there but rarely acknowledged issues around racial inequity. And so democracy hasn't led to solutions to these problems. And I think, often proponents of democracy place a premium on the procedural parts of it, the importance of process, the importance of inclusion and consultation, even representation of diversity. And, Biden has earned a lot of credit for his approach to those things. He has certainly one of the most diverse cabinets and broader appointments that we've seen. But I think he's aiming for a much bolder version of what democracy can do, that it's not just purely performative. It's not just purely about representation, that it's about what a democracy can produce, what government can produce, right? What you said about government can deliver, but really democratic government. And really that it can deliver on these bread and butter issues that really impact people's day-to-day lives, but in a way that also preserves dignity and does so with equity in mind. So I think that's really the point that he's trying to make, is that, democracy and good governance can and should go hand in hand.
And we'll talk about U.S. democracy promotion abroad when we come back. Ashley, you were a part of the task force organized by Freedom House, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and the McCain Institute that recently released a report that not only calls for expanded U.S. democracy promotion abroad, but also says that supporting democracy around the world should be, quote, at the heart of our foreign policy and national security strategy. Tell me a little bit more about what prompted this and the urgency behind the strong message the report is trying to send to policymakers.
The field of global democracy support really emerged out of the end of the Cold War, when there was a proliferation of new democracies emerging across every region, from the former Soviet Union to South America to Africa. And these were countries that were developing economically, as well as developing new systems of governance, nascent institutions. And they did rely on the support and assistance of Western democracies to help them in this work. So democracy, was on the march in those days. And we're just in a very different global paradigm now. Global autocracy is on the march, and democracy is in decline everywhere. Even mainstay democratic countries like India, like the United States, certain EU member states like Hungary and Poland, they're facing democratic decline, the rise of populist leadership. So that's one change. I think another change is that the world has radically changed. We have the rise of non-state actors. We have the rise of technology and social networks that carry both opportunities and risks. We have these big exogenous shocks like a pandemic,
right?
Financial crises, conflict, climate disasters, all of which are placing new pressures on governments to be able to adapt, to be able to best position themselves to respond to these crises, but also to ensure their own political survival. And so I think this report emerges out of a belief and a recognition that this paradigm, we are in a new paradigm, we're in a new context, and that really warrants a rethinking of the approach. And this report was an opportunity to offer what that approach should be.
What are a handful of the specific recommendations that it makes?
Yeah. So the task force recognized again that we were in this moment of sort of global retreat. And so it does make recommendations at a high level that, the administration really does need to elevate democracy as a part of our broad foreign policy agenda, as a part of our national security. And it makes sort of certain recommendations about how to do that, including through developing, for example, a national democracy strategy that would be closely linked to the national security strategy. But the rest of the report really gets at the how we do this. So it does recommend that we do some things that we've always done. For example, re-engage with partners and allies in ways that can help sort of the democratic community more effectively push back on authoritarianism, reinforce the cooperation and solidarity with those governments that share our values. And it also recommends that we scale up support and traditional pillars of democracy support, like free electoral processes, supporting independent media, supporting civil society, and all of these things are under pressure worldwide. The next couple of recommendations focus on addressing this new context. So there's a recommendation that we should really invest in a digital technology policy agenda. And I think that's really around recognizing that the internet is an important frontier for ensuring and securing that we have an open, secure, reliable platform, but that isn't going to be kind of weaponized in ways that that can be used for repression or to restrict human rights. And that's a sort of an active space that's being negotiated right now, and we need to very much participate in shaping that. And then there's a related recommendation that's focusing on the information environment and the need to rebuild trust in sort of combating the spread of disinformation, of hate speech. And then the last couple of recommendations really focus on this area of the economic dimensions of democratic governance. First, in terms of a need to combat corruption and kleptocracy. These are forces which help authoritarians and populists, but also really undermine the credibility of democratic systems when they play out there. And then also then to use U.S. economic power in ways that can more effectively address the forces of inequality and demonstrate, what President Biden was really arguing for, that democracy can deliver. And I think just really quick, the other thing I would say is that this strategy, sort of undergirding this strategy, is this belief that we can't credibly or effectively strengthen democracy abroad without doing the same at home. And so many of those strategies that are articulated in the report are going to be need to be deployed domestically as well as globally, and also why the task force recommends a foreign policy that can knit these two together across foreign and domestic.
Was there any sense in your discussions that there's a concern that Americans are tired of advancing democracy abroad, or that the pandemic, made us focus even more inward? I've seen the polling that I think most Americans welcome President Biden's decision to pull all U.S. troops from Afghanistan by September 11th this year, for instance. If he needs to, how should Biden persuade everyday Americans that promoting democracy abroad does serve their interests?
Yeah, we haven't, as a matter of foreign policy generally and of democracy support more specifically, done a good job of explaining it to the American public. And certainly, I think the U.S. needs to make clear that it will not seek to impose democracy through military intervention. And I think the U.S. should be more judicious about whether and how it does promote democracy in countries that are coming out of conflict or in highly oppressive regimes. These aren't projects that are likely to be successful. They're fraught with risk. They don't necessarily serve the interests of the everyday American. But I do think what we should convey, or what Biden should convey, is that what does serve our interest is living our values and supporting others who seek to fight for those values in their own context. And that we can lend our support in lots of ways through engaging in the competition of ideas that demonstrate the value of open and free societies, by offering would-be Democrats more exposure to our system. And then I think to Americans who remain skeptical, these are things that first don't cost very much in terms of resources, but can add value in terms of our overall objectives. But also to understand that democratic countries are important because of the things that they don't do, right? They don't engage in systematic oppression of their citizens. They don't engage in widespread human rights abuses, conditions which create refugees. And then these are situations that other countries have to respond to. They don't engage in wars generally with other democracies. And so they're reliable partners with, on issues of common concern like climate and health, for example. So we're living in an interconnected world where, especially now, where our adversaries are emboldened, and democracies need to be shorn up and need to stick together.
So how does Biden's plan for a democracy summit fit into all of this?
Yeah, the Democracy Summit, it has inspired a lot of opining in the democracy support community. And I think it's already grappling with this challenge, even just the language around it. It's actually a summit for democracy, but everybody, think about it as a summit of democracies, which then implies the question of who's invited and who's not,
right.
Included and excluded. And that's kind of like a question that sucks all of the air out of the room in terms of the substance of what this could or should be. And so it's sort of inherently a problematic issue with announcing this kind of event. But a few things, I think this is not intended to be a new institution, a replacement of existing mechanisms for democracy, like the Community of Democracies. It was interesting to see the recent climate summit that the administration organized, sort of designed to say to the world, America is back on this issue of climate. And I sort of think about this Summit for Democracy as a similar, sort of the objective around it is sort of similar to say America is back here in terms of promoting and advancing these values. Multilateral engagement around these issues are back. But I think the real opportunity for this is something that the task force discusses to some degree, is to use this summit to really galvanize these sort of linkages between the domestic and the global, sort of to engage in some meaningful domestic consultation around what the focus of U.S. democracy policy should be, to sort of engage, those activists here working on democracy on what we should take to the international table, and to encourage other countries to do the same, and to use that as kind of, a self-selection process, a minimum price of admission that we really do want to see this genuine domestic engagement, and we're gonna model and do that as well.
Ashley, when you joined us last summer, we also talked about the fight for racial justice in a global context, particularly in European democracies. And so while the movement has continued in the United States over the last year, has Europe seen the same level of sustained engagement? And in the context of how racial equity can advance democracy, how should the Biden administration better promote racial equity in its foreign policy and democracy promotion abroad in the context of everything we've been discussing?
Yeah, that's a big one. I do think, first of all, it is overstating what we saw in Europe last summer as a movement around racial justice and inequity. I think, is often the case, we did see protesters in Europe mobilize in solidarity with the Black Lives Matter protests in the United States. These are often opportunities for those folks in European and other countries to shine a light of issues on issues of domestic racism and police brutality in their own countries. But there has been, largely no movement, I would say, in those cases, like the case of Adama Traore in France, who died at the hands of the police. A lot of European countries have their own exceptionalism problems. They point to the U.S. as unique with regard to its record on racial injustice, which is true. The U.S. does have some of the worst statistics globally on our incarceration and police violence against minorities. But I think other countries, use the United States as a way to deflect criticism from their own citizens about the ways in which they have their own challenges with racism and police brutality in particular. The United Kingdom is an interesting example. They are a country that did take action on this in the aftermath of last summer. They created a commission on race and ethnic disparities. It made some quite controversial conclusions, really denying the existence of any kind of lingering systemic or institutional racism in the UK, even though, just like the United States, they had a disproportionate impact of the pandemic on their Black citizens. And a UN panel of human rights experts really criticized their report, sort of for whitewashing these kinds of issues. So it's become quite controversial there. I think it demonstrates the challenge of this, and I think also just the degree to which, events as horrible as they are, like the murder of George Floyd, they do open a window of opportunity where there might be an opening for some action, some introspection, some reckoning, but those windows soon close. And the backlash, it generally follows. And I think that's what we've seen in the case of the UK and other places. In terms of what Biden should do with Western allies, I do think that there are opportunities for especially majority white democracies to talk more honestly about these issues of bias and discrimination against racial and ethnic minorities. Again, we are in a unique position to be humble and to offer our own learning, and I think we can do so in partnership with our other Western counterparts to sort of address and talk about these issues more candidly. And this would be, for example, a great issue for the Democracy Summit, as if governments are going to take to heart consultation with their domestic constituencies, the degree to which these communities, for example, are included and these issues are included. And I think more broadly, all democracies are dealing with issues around where there are minority populations, religious minorities, ethnic minorities. These communities tend to be more at risk for some kind of marginalization or at risk for some kind of state violence or abuse. And so I think that that there's an opportunity to take this issue more to heart, both where it manifests itself in kind of, in terms of issues around race, but more broadly where we see other kinds of marginalization of minority groups.
We'll be right back to talk about the challenges Biden faces and how the United States can reconcile the task of sustaining a wounded democracy at home while supporting freedom abroad. Ashley, while American presidents have far more executive authority in foreign policy than domestic policy, enacting domestic reforms will prove more difficult, as President Biden can expect Republican opposition to much of his legislative agenda. What do you think are the chances for bipartisan discussion of the state of democracy, including things like voting rights?
So, the irony is, as you said, Laura, that democracy and human rights have always been an area of bipartisan support as a matter of foreign policy. But when we look at these issues as a matter of domestic policy, they become partisan very quickly because it implicates domestic electoral politics. So I think this is going to make it very hard to get bipartisan consensus on an issue like voting rights. I do think that on issues that focus more broadly on human rights, there is more traction for bipartisan action. So, one example is we saw overwhelming bipartisan support in the Senate for a bill to combat hate crimes against Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. And that was a really, really important step. I'm sure we'll see the same level of bipartisanship in the House. We also continue to see bipartisan interest in criminal justice reform, building off of legislation that was signed by President Trump and under when Congress was controlled by Republicans as well. So this is another area of where there, I think, increasingly is opportunity. And then I think it's also why policing reform seems to have better prospects on Capitol Hill than, for example, voting reforms do.
Yeah, I mean, as you said earlier in the show, I mean, the pandemic gave us, more opportunities for voting in some ways. People were more flexible, curbside for people who had COVID, expanded hours and other accessibility issues. So in ways that things could be positive. Do you see any opportunity for the conversation moving forward in the U.S. in a constructive way? And I'd be curious if you see parallels between conversations abroad around voting rights and access and those here in the United States.
Voting is always one of the most contentious areas, especially in a very contested election, just like here, just like in lots of places around the world. Most of the time, I would say globally, it really plays out in the processes that govern voter eligibility. So the processes that happen way before Election Day: voter registration, voter identification, and you see a lot of the real conflict or arguments between political parties in other countries playing out over this construction of the voter list, right? Who's eligible to vote and who's on the list or who's not. We have these debates in the United States. We certainly do. We talk about voter ID and eligibility, but the momentum now in terms of these laws that are being that are really proliferating around the country, they seem to be focused on tactics to limit accessibility for voters who are in fact eligible. So it's a really different focus, and it's really concerning, I think, in that way. And I think the really unfortunate thing about this discussion about voting in the United States is that there are likely reforms that could be undertaken that would improve voter confidence in the elections. Election confidence has been badly damaged, and post-election moments are sort of the best opportunity that we have, that we see globally for there to be kind of the space free from electoral politics to engage in some of those more difficult reforms. And so this was kind of our opportunity. We could have seen election integrity legislation be carefully crafted by listening to the concerns across the aisle, addressing the eligibility concerns of voters on the right, addressing the access concerns of voters on the left. But instead, we're not, most of the time we don't have a process like that where there's a consensus building. These bills are being rammed through without any consultation. And I think that's really only going to further undermine public confidence in elections, unfortunately.
As the U.S. continues to wrestle with the aftermath of the attack on the Capitol and this constant gridlock and polarization you were just talking about, we've seen Russia and China very quick to accuse the United States of hypocrisy or use these real struggles, as proof of democracy's failings. How should the Biden administration respond to those specific criticisms?
So I think Biden did this rather well in his joint address to Congress the other night. He did make the point that, yes, democracy has its problems, but it remains the best system of government to provide economic security and opportunity, but to do that without coming at the expense of political freedom and human rights. The United States experienced the worst attack on its democracy in decades, longer even, on January 6th. But the same day, it had repelled the attack. It had signaled to the world that the constitutional process would proceed undeterred, that we would have a transfer of power on time. And despite all of the debate, around and continued debate, I think that we are still having around the 2020 elections, I think we did prove that our institutions were resilient, that they were up to the task in some ways that the founders of this country anticipated. But I think that recent events, the events of January 6th in particular, have demonstrated that those who care about the preservation of democracy can't be complacent, that it can atrophy from within just as easily, maybe even more easily than it can be attacked from abroad. And so the work must be focused on domestically as well as globally on shoring up the forces that that gave way to January 6th, and I think that's why we've seen Biden focus so aggressively on this domestic extremism threat in particular.
Ashley, last question. Given these 100 days have just passed, and all of the issues that we've been discussing, if I made you give a report card to the administration on its efforts to bolster democracy at home and abroad, and how would you grade them? I'm going to force you to give them a grade. And then look, what are the most pressing action items that the administration should focus on? Like, the grade and their to-do list.
Yeah. It's hard. It's like, different spheres. It's hard. I'd give them a B+. Maybe I'm being magnanimous. I do think they've done a great job of making the rhetorical case for democracy, right? We have heard very strong rhetoric about democracy as a sort of center of a revitalization effort at home, globally. He has taken some important actions to signal the return of democratic values as a part of U.S. foreign policy, certainly in his engagement with Russia and China on, Hong Kong, on Alexei Navalny. He has, taken both strong diplomatic action as well as punitive measures to signal, our displeasure with these anti-democratic actions. But I think, it's easy in some ways to deal with your adversaries on these issues. These are non-democratic governments. We don't share the same values. It's sort of easier take these hard lines with those governments. The harder part is, how do you deal with your friends? How do you deal with the other democracies who are also struggling significantly? How do we deal with an India, for example? And I think we haven't seen the specifics from the administration on how it's going to deal with that, how we're going to shore up these more struggling democracies and have really candid conversations. I think we haven't seen the nuts and bolts about how they're going to do that in terms of the global, sort of the shift in the global landscape that the task force was focused on, in terms of the information environment, in terms of the internet, open internet issues. And so I think we need much more specifics on how they're going to respond to the change in landscape, how they're going to deal with their friends. And much specifically, they're going to do to make sure that democracy is shored up and secure for the next generation.
Ashley, good list. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Till next time. Thank you for listening to The World Unpacked, produced by the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. We are grateful for your listen and eager for your feedback. We welcome your emails at podcasts@ceip.org. And please rate and review us on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can find me, Laura Lucas Magnuson, on Twitter @Laura L. Magnuson. These discussions are made possible by our wonderful team behind the pod. Our audio engineer is Tim Martin, and our executive producer is Cliff Jayapranada. We'll see you next time.